Brad Sims screamed at his secretary as he pointed to the typo on the piece of correspondence that she had typed up for her review. As Christiana put her head down, Brad retreated to his office. Brad sat down in his chair and clasped his head as he thought about the day's events. The seemingly never-ending intake of work had gotten the better of him before. The news that the company had received another large order made him feel despondent. He wondered how the company could fill it given the other orders that were still in the process of being completed. Brad looked up and saw that the room seemed to be shifting around him. Brad rubbed his eyes as he closed them and tried not to think about his next move. The sound of Christiana knocking on his open office door made Brad flinch as he wondered what else was going to happen that day. Christiana walked in, staring down at the dejected face of her boss before she asked, "Are you all right, Brad?" Brad nodded his head and replied, "Yes, I'm just a bit overwhelmed." "By what?" Brad slowly raised his head and stared at her in silence for a few moments before he replied, "What do you think?" Christiana smiled and said, "I'm sorry, Brad, No, don't worry about it. I'm sorry I laid into you out there. I should have done it a little more diplomatically. Don't think twice about it. I know you're stressed out. Yes, it's been relentless around here the last 4 months. It's great that we have all this work, but coordinating things to make sure that my subordinates make sure everyone gets it done is getting to me." Christiana gave Brad a sympathetic nod as she closed the door to his office and sat down on the guest chair before his desk. Brad looked her over as she crossed her black sheer pantyhose-covered legs that peeked out from beneath the pencil skirt she was wearing. Brad loved how Christiana looked. She was everything he fantasized about being. Christiana leaned towards Brad, showing off her ample cleavage that was visible under the crossover V neckline of her sleeveless black and white blouse. She smiled at Brad as she said, "Maybe you could use some time away from your job." "I know I could, but it's hard to get away." "I'm sure it is when you're an important man." Brad nodded again as he rubbed his left cheek as Christiana continued, "Why don't you do the Seinfeld thing and take a vacation from yourself then?" Brad laughed as he leaned back in his chair and replied, "What, grow a mustache?" "Well, that's one way to do it, I guess, or maybe you could grow a goatee and become evil Brad." Brad smiled at her response and said, "There are plenty of people who consider me evil already. They don't know you like I do." "You know me?" "Of course." "How so?" "Well, I've been around you for 6 years now. I've set your schedule. I've read all the correspondence that comes to you and I draft most of your responses." "That doesn't mean you know me. You just know the part of me that shows up for this job." "True, but that's 60 hours a week, 52 weeks a year of your life. Between sleep and work, I think that's mostly what you are." "You haven't a clue," Brad replied as he leaned back in his chair. Christiana smiled as she replied, "Well, perhaps you could show me another side of you?" "How so?" Brad asked. "Well, maybe you'd like to swap places with me for a little bit. You know, just so you can catch your breath and refocus." "What do you mean?" "I mean you can be the secretary, and I'll be the boss." "You'd like that, wouldn't you?" Brad said with a laugh as he rubbed his legs to move the silky fabric of black tights he was wearing beneath his pants against his skin. "Maybe, but I know you like the idea." "How would you know that?" Brad replied as he fantasized about being in Christiana's position. He always wanted to be the one being talked down to and the one without the power. Brad's many years atop of the company had made wielding power mundane to him, and his fantasies all revolved around losing it. "Well, I see how you look at me when I'm working," Christiana answered. "How I look at you?" "Well, I think an equally good assumption is," Brad began to respond before cutting himself off as he thought about the potential sexual harassment lawsuit that might follow if he finished his statement. "There are other reasons," Christiana retorted with a smirk as she tilted her head. Brad was unnerved by the look on her face. He squirmed as he responded, "Well, whatever they are, I can't do it." "Oh, you can't do my job," Christiana replied with a smile and brief laugh. "Well, I'm sure I could do it." I'm a big boy. I can make copies and answer calls, Christiana. In fact, I would consider myself to be lucky to be able to do it. Lucky? Yes, you don't know how great you have it. You only have to show up on time and do what you're told. So it's not better to be the one rolling in late and telling everyone else what to do? Being the boss has its perks, I won't lie, but you don't get the stress that I do. I think you're better at pushing your stress downhill towards the rest of us than you give yourself credit for. Well, I have to keep things moving around here. I can't sit back and let things go off the rails. Like any of us could? I'm rushing around the office trying to get things done, make sure that things are sent out, and making sure that you're able to. I appreciate that. I see you moving around the office making copies, faxing things out, FedExing things, and sounding so sweet on the phone with our clients and suppliers. I'm glad to hear that you pay such close attention to me when I'm working, Christiana replied as she leaned back in her chair and rubbed her knee. You have to be observant in my position, Brad countered. I could see that, but I have to say I think you're a little more observant of me than I think a normal boss would be. I'm familiar with you too. Maybe we should swap jobs. I'll take on that stress you say I can't understand, and you can get away from it for a little bit. Brad laughed as he shook his head and replied, I can't do it. It won't work. You don't know what Brad, I read everything that reaches your desk, and I draft most of your correspondence. A lot of the times you don't even change my work. You just send it out. I deal with our clients every day on the phone. That's all true, but knowing that kind of stuff isn't the same as having to make decisions using that knowledge. I guess you're right, Christiana replied before continuing, and you probably couldn't do my job anyway. Brad shook his head and replied, I know I could. Why not prove me wrong then? Don't you think that other people would think it would be just a little a bit odd if we did? Brad retorted with a smile. Well, the company's whole corporate structure is built around keeping things secret. I know we only disclose the minimum and our standard employment contracts severely penalize discussing anything that goes on here with outsiders. Yes, but what if someone speaks anyway? Who will know? You don't speak to anyone in the building besides the vice president and the board secretary, me and the other admins. You let those two do all the real managing, you just set policy. There are employees who have been here for 10 years on the lower floors that have never seen you and think that you're some sort of myth when I mention that I'm your secretary. Brad leaned back in his chair again and thought about her proposal. He wanted to do it, but he knew it was simply out of the question. Brad put his elbows on his desk and leaned towards Christiana as he replied with a smile, Thanks for the offer, but I'm going to have to decline. Really, why? Why do you think? Look around? You noted it yourself, there'd be a number of people here who'd know that I demoted myself to a secretary. Don't you think that might be embarrassing for me, especially if it got to anyone who doesn't work on this floor? Christiana waved her hand and said, It wouldn't get out and anyway, it'll be good for you. It'll give you that mental health break you need. I think you'd do well to be dictated to for a while instead of making decisions. Your life can be just as easy as you seem to think mine is. Thanks, but I can't be a male secretary, it'd be weird. Well, what about a female one then? Are you crazy? No. You seem to know my position really well. You seem to enjoy how I dress, and your own words tell me that you seem to like the thought of being in my pumps, Christiana replied with a smirk. Now, I know you're nuts. Men can't put on a skirt and carry on like that, Christiana. Christiana smirked at Brad's response. She leaned towards and peered around his desk towards his legs. Brad squirmed as he pulled at his pants. Christiana's eyes darted up to Brad as she replied, Well, if men can't carry on in a skirt, apparently they can carry on in tights. Brad blushed as he replied, What are you talking about? You're wearing tights. No, I'm not. Yes, you are and you've done it before. Hell, you do it almost every day. I don't know what you're talking about, Brad said as he rubbed his neck while his face grew flush. Well, Brad, it's like when you lean back and your pant leg rides up on you and I get a good glimpse of the black tights you like to wear, or every once in a while, brown, white or gray or those nude pantyhose you wear in the winter when you shave your legs. Brad stared at Christiana in silence as she accurately described the hosiery he so often wore underneath his pants. He had never known that she had noticed that he wore tights, pantyhose or stockings beneath his suits almost every day. She had never mentioned it before, but from her accurate descriptions of his hosiery collection, he knew that there was no doubt that she was aware of his secret. Brad sighed before he asked, "Does anyone else know?" "Of course." "Who?" Brad inquired as he began to sweat. "Well, there's Jordan and Melanie and the secretaries. Melanie was the one who pointed out the bra straps beneath your shirt right after I started here." "Everyone on this floor knows?" Brad exclaimed. Christiana nodded as Brad clutched his head and stared down at his desk. He had always fantasized about being caught en femme, even though he thought that he had gone to great lengths to make sure that no one would ever find out. He could not believe that his cross-dressing was as obvious as Christiana was intimating. "Why didn't anyone ever mention it to me?" Brad asked. "How was it going to come up?" Christiana countered. Brad shrugged his shoulders before Christiana continued, "It's also not the sort of thing you want to inquire to your boss about. It'd be a bit uncomfortable to do. I was a bit uncomfortable bringing it up and you practically led me to talking about it." Brad nodded and understood his subordinate's reluctance to ask him about why he was wearing women's undergarments. Brad realized that it was not the kind of thing that an employee would ask their boss if they wanted to keep their job. Brad got up and walked out of his office and walked towards Melanie Hubble and Jordan Gavala's offices. He looked at their two secretaries and asked, "Girls, is there anything you find odd about my choices in clothing?" The girls looked uneasily at each other and shook their heads before Jordan's secretary, Allison Mariano, replied, "No. Really, there's nothing you find odd?" The girls looked at each other once again before Christiana nodded to them and said, "I told him that you know." The girls went white as they looked at Brad. The expressions on their face told Brad that Christiana was telling the truth. Melanie stepped out of her office as she heard Brad speak. He looked over to her and asked, "And you know too?" "Well, yes, but I didn't want to bring it up." "Why not? You just talked about it behind my back." "What was I going to say? It's not something that comes up in everyday conversation." Brad threw up his hands and walked back to his office with Christiana following closely behind. Brad looked at her as he thought about what she was offering to him. Brad realized that the very people he feared would discover his cross-dressing were already aware of it. Brad knew that they had not spoken a word of it and likely would not give the oppressive terms of their employment contracts. If any of them spoke about Brad's cross-dressing to outsiders, Brad knew that they were well aware that they would be civilly liable for several years of their pay. The contractual penalties made the idea of swapping roles with Christiana slightly more palatable for him. Brad did not engage in much face-to-face interaction with clients. He had salespeople who were gaining big orders for him in recent years, and he had largely pulled back from the social aspects of running the company. Brad was much more focused on making sure the company ran smoothly as he delegated the company's marketing and client development to others. Brad had occasional telephone conversations with major clients, but most of his communications with them were by email or letter. The more Brad thought about it, the more he felt that Christiana's idea was not nearly as precarious as he first assumed. Brad reached for his phone and called Jordan and Melanie and asked them to come into his office. The two came in and Melanie took a seat next to Christiana as Brad explained Christiana's proposal to them. Jordan scratched the back of his neck as he asked, "Are you seriously considering this?" Brad nodded at his company's vice president as he replied, "I could use a little break from the stress of the job." Jordan and Melanie acknowledged his stress before Melanie pointed out that they were both more experienced and qualified to take over the company than Christiana. Brad agreed with their assessment, but he explained that he did not want them ordering him around since he would be returning to his position eventually and they would be expected to carry out his orders as his key lieutenants. Jordan and Melanie both knew that there was no use trying to reason with Brad once he made a decision. Brad was decisive and almost never backed away from a decision once he made it. They exited the room and left Brad to negotiate the terms of his job swap with Christiana. 3 days after Christiana's made her proposal, Brad and Christiana signed the contract to make it happen. The contract provided that they would swap jobs for 3 months, but Christiana insisted on a provision extending the life of the contract in the event that she brought in a certain amount of money from new clients and the expanding of existing clients' accounts. Brad was happy enough to give it to her. He was sure she would fail, and if she did not, then Brad figured that he would eventually inherit a company that was doing better after he got some time away from having the crushing responsibilities that his position in the company forced upon him. The contract was structured so that the swap would continue for another month for every set interval of profit that Christiana added to the existing bottom line of the company. Brad was not worried about the provision and liked the excitement of the idea of being perpetually trapped in his new position even though he was certain that it would never happen. The contract's additional provisions provided that Christiana was prohibited from firing Brad and had a strong liquidated damages clause that would provide Christiana with 51% ownership of the company if Brad breached the contract. The contract further provided that they would swap pay for the life of the contract. Brad was independently wealthy from his many years of owning the company, so the loss of a few months of much higher income through less tax dividends did not pose much of a concern for him. The terms of the contract further provided for their living quarters. Since they were both making what the other had previously made, they agreed to swap homes for the life of the contract as well. Christiana was going to make all tax, mortgage and utility payments for Brad's spacious suburban home while Brad was going to make all the payments required for Christiana's apartment. Christiana was also going to take Brad's company-provided limousine. Brad figured that he did not need it anyway since Christiana's apartment was close to a city subway stop. Brad wasted little in signing the contract that required him to work in femme as Christiana's secretary under the assumed name of Bailey Field. Brad smirked at the fact that he would have to abide by all the rules that the other secretaries and other women in the company were required to follow. Brad had crafted those rules to correspond with his fantasies to the greatest extent possible under the law. The thought of being restricted by his own rules excited Brad. With the contract in place, Brad began to plan the transition. He had his female wardrobe brought over to Christiana's apartment and had her clothing taken to his home. They decided to leave each other's home furnished as they were so little had to be done prior to their job swap that was scheduled to occur 2 weeks after the contract signing. The day before the swap was supposed to occur, Brad and Christiana swapped keys and went to each other's home. They let themselves in and looked around at the new surroundings that they would call home for the life of the contract. Christiana marveled at the 3 acres of well-manicured grass and landscaping that surrounded Brad's home, while Brad walked into the 450 square feet of apartment space that Christiana had previously called her own. While his home had a deck that overlooked the water, his new apartment had a fire escape that overlooked Chinese and Pakistani restaurants. The sounds of geese and motorboats that were always present at his home were replaced by the sounds of backing up trucks, bickering neighbors and car horns. Brad smiled for a moment as he thought about how small and unimpressive the apartment was while he walked around it. Christiana, conversely, was amazed by the size of Brad's house as she walked around the home with the windows open. The relaxing scent of the salty sea air coming through the windows seemed so much different to her from the diesel fumes she was used to smelling coming through the windows of her apartment. Christiana had never been in Brad's home, although she had heard about it before. There were 7 bedrooms, including a master bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment. The apartment's small kitchenette and eating area could easily fit within a quarter of Brad's kitchen. The home had an eat-in kitchen and a formal dining room. The living room and den were both larger than her apartment as well. Brad walked through the small apartment and felt almost claustrophobic as he sensed that the walls were right on top of him. Brad had never lived in an apartment as small as Christiana's. Brad smiled at its size as he heard the footsteps of the apartment dwellers above him through the ceiling. Brad could not help but feel excited by his meager surroundings. They all served to remind him of his new temporary place at the bottom of the corporate world that he had ruled only the day before. Brad opened the bedroom's closet door and looked at the feminine wardrobe he had been accumulating for 10 years. There were several skirt suits and dresses for him to wear to work the next day. He had been dressing for years at home and could not wait to wear each outfit to work for the first time, even though he wondered what people would say about him. Brad figured that no one would pay him any notice or give him any real trouble if they thought that he was a man, since he would be out in public and, thus, surrounded by witnesses. Brad selected a black pencil skirt, a sleeveless cable knit crew neck sweater, and a pair of light gray, rounded toe, patent leather pumps with a 4-inch heel and a 1-inch platform for his first day in his new position before he went back out to the living room area of the apartment to get further acquainted with his new surroundings. After settling in, Brad walked into Christiana's bedroom and removed his clothing. He dressed in slip and got under the covers and fell asleep. "Oh, my God! Look at that little faggot. I can't believe he actually did it," Melanie said as Brad squirmed and clutched at the hem of his dress that seemed to keep creeping ever higher up as he listened to his former staff berate him. "I told you he was a total fairy just pretending to be a man," Jordan added as Brad tried to defend himself. His tearful words moved no one and only cemented their opinions of him. "Look at him. Crying like a baby. He's definitely not a man," Jordan said. "Well, we don't want him," Melanie replied. "We're not taking him either. He's not a woman, and he's not a man. He's a sissy," Christiana added. "A big whimpering sissy who probably likes to take it up the ass," Melanie said. Brad buried his face in his hands as he began to sob uncontrollably. He opened his eyes and looked around his bedroom and felt his heart racing. The nightmare of exposure played out in his head as he thought to himself, "Oh, God, what have I gotten myself into?" He wondered if his subordinates could really be trusted to keep his secret. They already knew what was coming, but he was going to be providing them with visual proof of it, which was another matter altogether. Brad rolled onto his side and tried to fall asleep again. Brad wiped the sweat off of his brow as he tried to put all the potential dangers of the day ahead out of his mind. He watched the hours tick away on his alarm clock as he tried desperately to fall asleep. Brad had never had trouble sleeping and could not help but fear that he would be sleep-deprived for his first day in heels. An hour after he was finally able to fall asleep, Brad's alarm clock went off. He stumbled out of his bed and hit the alarm button. He thought about climbing back into his bed for a few more minutes of sleep, but he knew that it would not be of any real help to him. Brad walked into his bathroom and turned on the shower. He washed himself thoroughly with a strawberry-scented body wash that he usually reserved for his weekends en femme. Brad smiled as he began to get excited as he remembered the strange looks girls would give him when they noticed the lingering traces of the strong fruity scent on his body when he shopped on the weekends. Brad inspected his body as he washed himself to make sure that there was not a trace of body hair on it. Satisfied with the bliss-inducing smoothness of his body, Brad began to wash his hair with the pineapple-scented shampoo and conditioner. Brad ran his fingers through his brown hair as he rubbed the shampoo into his hair. His hair was long for a man, but not for a woman. The ends of his hair rested an inch above his shoulders, so he was not concerned about his hair giving away his gender. After he finished washing his hair, Brad stepped out of the shower and patted dry his body. He wrapped the towel around his chest to try to feel more like the woman he was going to try to pass himself off as, even though he had nothing to cover up on his chest at the moment. Brad reached into one of the vanity's drawers and removed Christiana's hairdryer and a brush. Brad dried and brushed out his naturally straight hair. He always wore it to work in a low ponytail, but he preferred to let his hair hang down and frame his heart-shaped face when he was en femme. As he put away the brush and hairdryer, Brad could not stop sneaking peeks at himself in the mirror. All the worries he had felt about what he was doing left his mind as he looked at his feminine hairstyling. He stared into the mirror and began twirling his hair between his fingers and wondering if he should get a permanent wave put it in like some of the girls at his job had. The sound of a car's blasting horn ended Brad's self-admiration. Brad stepped out of the bathroom and checked the time. He hurried back to his bedroom and dressed in the clothing he had selected for himself the night before. Brad put on a pair of padded extended leg panties to help keep his member tucked away before he pulled up a pair of control top pantyhose to further help keep secure his member between his legs. Brad smiled as he looked at his rear in the mirror. The panties were cushioned with 2-inch foam pads that made his rear look much bigger than it was. Brad loved the way it made him look and knew he had to wear it anyway since all of his skirts and dresses had been tailored to fit around his false rear. Brad then reached for his breast forms and glue. Brad had owned the breast forms for years. They were B-cups that were intended to give him unmistakably feminine curves, but also to not draw as much attention as larger breasts were prone to garnering. With the breast forms secured to his chest, Brad put on a black bra that matched his panties. Brad then put on his white sweater and pencil skirt. Brad carried his heels into the living room and placed them down before he walked into the kitchen to make himself a bowl of instant oatmeal. While Brad was not a particular fan of the bland taste, he had not eaten anything but plain oatmeal for breakfast in over 10 years. It was all part of his carefully crafted diet that he strictly adhered to so that he could maintain his svelte figure. Brad ate his breakfast with a cup of tea. While he always drank coffee during the week, Brad drank tea whenever he was en femme. Brad always thought that there was something effeminate about drinking tea and it helped him feel more like Bailey. With his breakfast finished and his departure time fast approaching, Brad scurried into the bathroom to put on his makeup. Brad put his years of training to good use as he deftly put on his mascara, lipstick, foundation, and eyeliner. Satisfied with his understated makeup, Brad smiled at the face he believed was both feminine and plain enough that no one would notice it. Brad rushed over to his shoes and his black wool jacket. He put the jacket on and then slipped his feet into the shoes. Brad clasped his purse and headed out the door. As he walked towards the stairs, he slipped the strap of the purse around his shoulder. Brad grabbed hold of the railing as he carefully descended the steps, careful to land his feet on angle to ensure that both the heel and toe of his shoe landed fully on the step below as he had practiced so many times at his secluded estate. He breathed a sigh of relief as he took his last step down the steep staircase. He walked out the door of the building after taking a deep breath. He looked around as he walked down the street en femme for the first time. He searched for anyone giving him an inquisitive look, but one noticed him. Brad felt a surge of arousal as he realized that no one was paying any attention to him. Brad realized that he could pass himself off as a woman amongst strangers, at least when they did not have a reason much attention to him. Brad tried not to smile as he walked towards the subway entrance. He descended the stairs behind a woman wearing heels who was moving the same speed as him while men rushed past them down the middle of the staircase. Brad walked through the subway station and swiped his card before he went through the turnstile. Brad then waited at the platform for the subway train to come. The air in the subway was very warm, which made Brad start to sweat. He rarely rode on the subway given the privacy provided by his limousine. Brad smiled when he thought of Christiana riding to work that day from the stately manor he had purchased in his limousine while he was surrounded by a mass of people speaking various languages as he traveled to work from her small apartment. After the subway car pulled up, Brad got inside. He scrambled for a seat and got one before the subway train jerked forward onto its next stop. As Brad watched people get on and off at the next stop, he wondered what those that knew him would say if they could see him at that moment. While the strangers around him left him alone in silence, not speaking any doubts that they might have about his true gender, Brad knew that there were a few people at work were well aware of whom he really was. Brad felt more nervous than he could ever remember feeling as he thought about their reactions. The alluring nature of his situation drifted from his mind as the reality of his situation made him feel scared and unusually vulnerable. As the car came to a stop and another group of people entered, Brad became distracted by a girl that had entered the subway car. Brad did not find her attractive, but he knew that there was something unusual about her. He looked at her vaguely mannish face as she stood holding a railing in the cramped car. Brad's eyes veered down at the purple sweater covering her thick upper body and the ill-fitting black skirt that rested over her well-muscled legs that were encased in black, opaque tights. Brad's eyes finally fixated on the slightly large feet that were partially covered by a pair of black ballet flats decorated with a bow at the vamp. Brad looked up at the transvestite's face and saw the person start to squirm. Brad wanted to tell her it was all right, but his own situation made him feel uncomfortable doing so. The transvestite turned away from him and stared out the window at the dark subway walls while Brad's attention turned elsewhere. Not long after, the subway train came to a stop and Brad exited the subway car and headed for the exit. He ascended the staircase leading to the city's surface streets and walked down the crowded midtown sidewalks without anyone paying much attention to him. Brad felt excited as he made the 2-block walk in Femme for the first time. There was no other experience in his life he could remember giving such a thrill as he felt surrounded by thousands of people passing by as he walked among them in a skirt and heels. As his office building came into view though, Brad's excitement dimmed. A sense of foreboding overtook him once more. The feeling of dread became more intense with each step he took towards the door. He paused a few hundred feet from the door and stood against the stone wall at the base of the building. He took a few deep breaths and thought about what could happen when he walked through the front door. Brad knew that there was a risk that his cross-dressing would get out beyond those that he wanted to know in the company. The company was important enough that several of the local papers might be interested in the story if they were able to get pictures of him en femme. Brad was protected by the fact that very few people in any industry he dealt with had ever met him or seen a picture of him. Brad had gone to great lengths to never post a picture of himself and had limited close contact to only a few select underlings and important clients over the years. While he knew that his secret was already out, Brad realized that the minute he walked through that door the employees he worked closely with would see what they had only speculated about before. Brad knew that mere speculation about what he looked like en femme was much different than people actually being to confirm his feminized appearance with their own eyes. Whatever they thought of him was going to be cemented by his appearance in a skirt and heels that morning. Brad wondered if any of his underlings would ever view him as an authority figure again after he went through with being Christiana's skirted secretary for a few months. The minute he walked through that door, Brad knew that things in his workplace would be changed forever. His mere appearance that morning would see to that. It all seemed too much to him. Brad started to back away from the door and turned to walk away. He stopped himself and cursed himself for a moment for the weakness he was feeling. He did not want to turn his back on the deal and knew that he could not because of the contract he had signed. He looked back down the street as he saw a limousine pulling up in front of the building. Brad watched as Christiana swung her legs together as she exited the limousine. The driver closed the door behind her as she walked towards the door clutching her pocketbook. She looked down the street and saw Brad standing still and watching her. Christiana motioned for Brad to come towards her. Brad took a deep breath and forced a smile onto his face as he walked towards her. Christiana stared at Brad, sizing him up with her eyes as he started to walk towards her. Christiana inspected Brad from head to toe with each step Brad took. Christiana smiled at Brad as he came to a stop in front of her as she said, "Bailey, I didn't think you could look so presentable." Brad blushed and lied, "I surprised myself too." Christiana smiled at Brad's unease and said, "It's getting near 9. You don't want to be late now, do you, dear?" Brad shook his head and walked into the building, followed closely behind by Christiana. Brad headed for the elevator and pushed the button. He waited beside Christiana and 2 male workers he did not recognize. Christiana engaged Brad in conversation, which made him uneasy as the 2 male workers listened to them talk. Brad strived to make his voice as girlish-sounding as possible without coming off as a male trying to speak in a comically feminine voice. The 2 men paid them no attention and got on the elevator with them. The 2 men got off on their floors while Brad and Christiana continued up on their trip to the top floor where the executives' offices were. As the elevator continued its ascent, Brad thought back to the hundreds of times he had been in that elevator with Christiana. Cristiano would be wearing a skirted outfit, not unlike the one he was wearing while he was dressed in a tailored suit. Now, instead of giving her instructions, he was listening to her tell him about the day she had planned and what she expected of him. Brad felt his member growing between his legs as Christiana told him that she expected him to be as good of a secretary for her as she had been for him. Brad nodded and agreed that she should expect nothing less. Of course, Brad was certain that he could do a better job than she had. He figured that he was smarter than her and, accordingly, he assumed he would be able to more efficiently manage his time as a secretary than she could. The elevator doors opened, and Brad followed closely behind Christiana as she led the way to the chief executive's officer's corner office suite. It had been a walk they had taken hundreds of times before. It felt different this time for both of them since Christiana was now the one walking in front while Brad followed in tow. The reversal of the situation excited Brad as he watched his beautiful assistant turned boss walk in front of him in a pantsuit. She rarely wore pantsuits as she was very proud of her slender legs, and Brad figured she wore it that day to reinforce their new positions to both of them. Christiana walked through the open office suite door and turned to face Brad as he reached the secretary's desk that was catty-cornered in front of the office suite's door. Christiana smiled at Brad as she closed the door behind her. Brad felt another twitch between his legs as he realized that Christiana was momentarily excluding him from the office he had designed to his own specifications. Brad placed his pocketbook down on the secretary's desk that he was going to be calling his own for the following 3 months. Brad sat down on the black fabric-covered chair that seemed so different from the high-backed, leather executive's chair he had in his office. His utilitarian chair was stiffer and less comfortable and was more fitting for his new position. Brad looked around the office and saw the other secretaries looking at him. They stayed away from him, as they were unsure how they should greet him. Brad put his head down and tried to ignore them as he logged onto his computer. As he opened up Microsoft Outlook, he looked down at his desk and saw the memorandum sitting on the corner of his desk. Brad reached over and looked it over. As he read the memorandum prepared by Christiana, Brad thought about the order he would do the tasks that she had given him for the day. Brad got started by adding some contacts into Christiana's email address book that had been his the week before. Brad looked over the various business cards that had been provided for prospective and current clients as he typed in their contact information. When he finished, he heard Christiana stirring behind him. He turned towards the office door as he heard it opening. Christiana looked down at him as she asked, "Bailey, please get me a cup of coffee." Brad nodded to her and took the cup from her hand before she moved back into her office. Brad looked down the corridor that led to the kitchenette and saw the various people who had been avoiding him all morning. He knew that he could no longer hide in plain sight from them or vice versa. They were going to have to confront the elephant in the room that they and he had been trying to avoid discussing. Brad took a deep breath and slowly exhaled before he walked in small steps down the corridor that required him to walk past the area where a group of secretaries and other support staff workers were seated. As Brad got closer to them, he saw each of them notice him one by one. Their eyes would invariably look at him for a moment before they would quickly dart away. Brad looked at the 4 girls who were trying to pretend that they had not noticed him walking towards them. Brad could see the unease on their faces. He understood that they were in a difficult position since he was still technically the owner of the company, and they knew that he would almost certainly become the chief executive officer again. Brad knew that they had to tread on delicate ground around him en femme. Brad came to a stop and decided to confront them. He looked at the 4 girls. 2 of them were Melanie and Jordan's personal secretaries, Allison and Becky James. Another was an office girl named Sasha Regalski, while the last was the office manager, Emily Dean. "Hi girls," Brad said before he watched 3 of the girls cringe before looking at him. Only Allison looked at him without showing any noticeable displeasure that she had to acknowledge him. Becky responded with a quick hello before Sasha and Emily repeated her one-word greeting. Allison smirked at them as they squirmed in Brad's presence before she replied, "Hi, I'm Allison." "It's Bailey, right?" "Yes it is," Brad replied as he shook Allison's hand and smiled at her grinning face. He enjoyed how she divorced his male self from the feminine alter ego that he was presenting himself as in the office for the first time. "It's a pleasure to meet you," Allison continued. "Same here," Brad replied. "So where are you from?" Allison asked. Brad told her what neighborhood his apartment was in, prompting Allison to smile as she realized that it was where Christiana had lived. Brad noticed grins come across the other girls' faces as they realized the extent of the swap that Brad had made with Christiana. "How is it working for Christiana?" Allison inquired. "Miss Stone is," Brad began to respond before Allison interjected. "Wait, Miss Stone? She makes you call her by her last name?" "Well, no. I just think it's the proper thing to do." "Now, that's old school," Allison replied with a smile. "I'm a traditionalist," Brad replied, prompting giggles from the girls as they contrasted his claim against his feminized appearance. "A man in a dress, yes, real traditional," Emily thought to herself as she shook her head. Allison shook her head with a grin before she replied, "Well, given that outfit, I'd say you are a bit of traditionalist." "I'm not a fan of office casual," Brad replied before Allison complimented his outfit. While Brad continued to talk with Allison, Christiana came out of her office, wondering where her coffee was. She looked down the corridor and saw Brad speaking with Allison. Christiana shook her head as she shouted, "Bailey, I'm not paying you to socialize. I need that coffee, now." "Yes, Miss Stone," Brad replied with a faint concern before he winked at Allison. Brad smiled as he walked away from the girls. Brad walked into the kitchenette and headed for the coffee maker. He made a cup of coffee for Christiana and put in milk and a little sugar. Brad knew how Christiana liked her coffee because she had informed him about it from time to time, as she commented on his preference to drink his coffee black to avoid taking in excess calories. With the cup in hand, Brad walked down the corridor slowly, careful not to spill any of the coffee. He walked towards Christiana's office door and gently knocked on it as he peeked his head through the open doorway. Christiana looked up at him briefly before he walked in and placed the cup down. As he did so, Christiana asked, "Bailey, can you please bring me the Bennett brothers file?" "Will do," Brad replied. Brad walked out of Christiana's office and scurried towards the file cabinet where the physical records of several big accounts were kept. Brad located the file and carried it back to Christiana. Christiana took the file from him and asked, "Do you know where the proposed contract that came in last week is?" Brad nodded and pulled the contract from the file. He had reviewed the contract the week before, but he had not rendered a decision regarding it as he wanted to wait until the company's lawyers finished their review of the contract. As Christiana began to look over the terms of the contract, Brad said, "Christiana, I think." "Hush, now, Bailey. I don't pay to think. I pay you to make copies and get me a good cup of coffee. Now, run along, dear." Brad stared at Christiana in stunned silence. He could not believe that she had completely rejected his advice without even bothering to hear it. Brad could not remember the last time he had been treated so dismissively. A gnawing feeling in his stomach accompanied his displeasure, even as the reality of being treated in such a manner also excited him. While Christiana continued to read the contract, Brad turned away from her and walked back out of her office and sat down at his desk. Brad propped his head up with his arm as he rested his elbow against the cherrywood desktop. He kept replaying Christiana's dismissive words in his head. He felt slightly bothered by the tone and the words. Christiana made it seem as if his opinion was meaningless while he was used to having the final say in everything in his life. Brad rubbed his pantyhose-covered left leg with his hand and began to feel better about what had happened. Brad realized that Christiana's was right to disregard his opinion. He had been as dismissive of her in the past. Brad smiled as he concluded that it was a part of his temporary life that he was going to have to get used to. It might do me some good to not be the one with all the power for once, Brad thought. A smile came across his face as he realized that Christiana was treating just the way he fantasized about being treated as a secretary. He was a low-level employee and not the boss, and he loved being treated accordingly. The smile faded as he felt some pain in the balls of his feet. Brad slipped his feet out of his heels and began to rub them before he slipped his feet back into them and continued doing the work that Christiana had ordered him to do. Brad's typing of draft email responses to underlings asking for direction from Christiana was broken up periodically by phone calls from employees and the company's outside accountants and attorneys. Brad would advise them about Christiana's temporary promotion, which elicited more than a little confusion before he transferred them to her. After transferring a call from the head of the accounting firm used by the company, Brad got to his feet to get a cup of tea for himself. He walked past the group of office workers and grinned at Allison as he pretended to speed up as he walked past her. Allison let out a slight laugh as Brad entered the kitchenette and made himself a cup of tea. After he went back to his desk, Brad set up a few meetings for Christiana with the company's outside advisors. Brad saw nothing odd about it as he frequently had the company officers meet with them as he had no desire for face-to-face communication with them. He figured that Christiana wanted to take a more hands-on approach to it, and he saw nothing wrong with that. As Brad began to feel a bit hungry around 1 p.m., he got back to his feet and headed towards the kitchenette. He reached into the refrigerator and took hold of the Greek yogurt he had left in it over the weekend. He placed it down on the counter and took out a plastic spoon from a box in the kitchen. He then poured himself a cup of water from the water cooler, picked up the yogurt and headed back towards his desk. As he walked past the office girls again, Allison asked, "Is that your lunch?" Brad nodded as he turned towards her. "That's it?" Becky asked to clarify. Brad responded slowly, "Yes." Becky shook her head before she responded, "I could never eat that little for lunch." Brad smiled at the heavy-set woman and decided it was best to not respond directly to her remark before he said, "Well, I've been eating yogurt for 10 years. The Greek yogurt is a little change of pace for me. I like the texture of it better than the regular stuff." Emily nodded and said, "It's definitely better. I hate yogurt, but I like Greek yogurt." Sasha nodded before she asked Brad, "So is that you keep your figure?" The other 3 girls looked at her before they nervously looked at Brad to see how he would respond. Brad noticed that the other girls' unease had made Sasha's face turn white. Brad smiled as he responded, "That's part of it." Sasha let out a sigh of relief before Allison asked, "What's the rest of it then? Do you have any secrets you might want to share?" Brad looked over Allison. Allison was a thick woman, but not overweight. Her body was well-toned and she carried the weight well. She had an hourglass-curved body that made more than a few men in the company fall over themselves to please her. She was the only one of the 4 of them to ever get hit on by an officer or an employee in the company. Men who ordinarily knew better than to engage in office relationships lost their sensibilities around her. The other girls occasionally showed their jealousy of her, but they were friendly with her as well. Brad knew that Allison did not actually want any tips from him, but he could tell that Sasha and Becky did. Brad responded, "I have a strict diet that I've adhered to for a year. I only eat 1 bowl of oatmeal for breakfast, eat a container of yogurt for lunch, and then I vary my dinner a little bit here and there." "And you don't pass out?" Becky asked before laughing. "No, my body's used to it." "Well, what do you do if you get hungry?" Becky asked before she took a handful of the M&Ms she kept in a bowl on her desk and put them in her mouth. "Well, I usually try to deal with it by drinking a cup of coffee or tea. That usually tides me over, but when I need a snack, I'll eat a piece of fruit," Brad replied before he cringed a little as he felt a shooting pain in his ankles. "I could never do that," Becky replied laughing and shaking her head. Emily followed a similar diet to Brad's and was very slender in a boyish way. Brad always felt that she could stand to gain a little weight to make herself more attractive to men, but she felt that her emaciated frame was all she had going for her and always saw Becky as a cautionary tale of putting on weight. Becky had been thin in her youth before having 2 children. She had never slimmed back down after the pregnancies and her husband had run off with a younger slender woman. The justifiable bitterness she saw in Becky made Emily determined to never let that happen to her. Emily asked, "And what do you drink?" "I only drink water, coffee, tea, milk, some juice, usually orange or tomato, and wine." Emily nodded as she replied, "I only drink water, juice, and wine. That's it. I won't even touch anything else." Emily's reply prompted Sasha, Becky, and Allison to shake their heads. All three enjoyed drinking and eating far too much to ever follow the diets that Emily and Brad maintained to keep their figures. Brad then walked back to his desk and ate his lunch there as he logged onto the internet and looked at clothing and shoes he wanted online while Christiana was out of the office at a lunch meeting. Shortly after he finished his lunch, Brad saw Christiana walking down the corridor towards her office door. Brad slipped his feet back into the heels he had taken off as he sat down to eat lunch. Christiana asked if she had any calls while she was gone, and Brad replied that he sent her email messages regarding each person that called for her. Christiana nodded before she handed him a stack of papers and asked him to make 3 copies of them and send them out by Federal Express. Brad nodded and got to his feet. He fought the urge to cringe as he walked towards the copier, feeling an increasing pain in his feet and calves that was starting to cause his lower back to hurt as well. Brad made the copies and periodically bent down to rub his thighs while the machine hummed beside him. Brad collected the copies and assembled them. He carried them back to his desk and prepared a Federal Express label and envelope before he carried the package towards Sasha and told her that Christiana wanted the package sent that afternoon. Sasha got to her feet and headed for the elevator while Brad walked back towards his desk. Brad slipped off his heels again and began to massage his feet as he printed out Christiana's schedule for the next day. He then put his shoes back on and carried the print out to Christiana and asked her if she needed anything on the schedule changed. Christiana shook her head and let Brad walk out of her office. Brad sat down on his chair and immediately removed his shoes. He had completed everything on the list Christiana had provided for him, and he spent the rest of the day answering phone calls and tending to the requests that Christiana had as the day went on. Brad spent the last few hours of his workday thinking about his new position. Brad was enjoying himself and wanted it to never end. The only displeasure the day had brought him came from his shoes, but even that pain excited him. Brad knew that he was experiencing the kind of pain that every woman in his position felt at one time or another. The pain was a reminder of his position. As the workday ended, Brad could not wait for the next day. Brad awoke the next day to the sound of his alarm clock. He stumbled out of bed and hit the alarm before he limped towards the bathroom holding his lower back. The residual pain in his back from wearing heels the day before made him realize why all the girls in his office carried a pair of flats with them. Brad went through the same morning routine he had gone through the day before. He was slowed slightly by the aches in his body before he left the home dressed in a beige, tie-waist, sleeveless wrap dress with diagonal draping, a wide neck and a concealed side zip closure and black suede flats. Brad made his way to the subway station and got on his train and headed for the office without issue. Brad entered the building and got off on his floor and walked to his desk. Brad sat down and took off his flats and put them in his purse before he took out the beige 3-inch heel pumps with crisscross straps at the peep toe and placed them on his feet. Brad then turned his attention to the memorandum that Christiana had left for him on her way out the door the night before. Brad looked over his tasks for the day and began to start working on reorganizing some of the office's files. Brad's reorganization of the files was broken up periodically by Christiana, who asked him to do little tasks for her throughout the day. Brad was happy to do them at first, pausing his work to make her copies, fax documents, compose correspondence, and get her coffee, but the little tasks she was adding kept making his reorganization of the files take longer. Every time he returned to organizing the files, he had to take a few minutes to remember where he was before he could get started again. Christiana noticed that this was flustering Brad, so she made sure to make more requests of him than she needed to. Brad began to feel stressed as Christiana's tasks were making it impossible for him to complete the more important tasks she had provided for him to do in writing. As Brad carried in a bundle of copies that Christiana would not need for another week, Christiana asked. How are you coming along with the file reorganization? I'm working on it, Brad replied. Still? This shouldn't take you that long. But you keep pulling me away from it. Brad countered as he threw his hands up in the air. Excuses, excuses. Get it done, Christiana replied as she waved her hand at him dismissively. Brad bit his lip and stomped out of her office towards the filing cabinets. Brad wanted to scream in frustration as he began to think about his task at hand again. His concentration was broken as he kept thinking about Christiana's attitude. She was very demanding and dismissive of him. While he had always daydreamed about being treated like that while he was spending his workdays as the boss, his reactions in his fantasies no longer matched reality. While he was aroused by it the day before, he found that he was growing aggravated with it. Brad remembered a Seinfeld episode and kept mumbling to himself, serenity now, before he began working on the file reorganization again. After getting 10 minutes into the task, Christiana walked over to him and said, Bailey, I have a very important meeting this afternoon. I need you to call in an order for the deli up the block. Brad wanted to scream in frustration as Christiana smirked at him. Brad took a deep breath and asked, Okay. What am I calling in? Brad listened to her order and walked towards his desk as Christiana followed behind him. He took hold of a pen and wrote down what Christiana wanted him to order for the meeting. Christiana then turned and walked back into her office while Brad sat down at his and instinctively removed his heels almost the second he situated himself in the chair. Brad called in the order for delivery and then got back to his feet and went back to work. Brad muttered to himself about Christiana as he continued reorganizing the files. Brad felt that he was little more than her servant and wanted his old job back. Still, Brad knew that he had put himself in the situation he was beginning to hate. Brad did not dislike it entirely though. He still enjoyed the feeling of his clothing and his brief conversations with Emily, Allison, Becky and Sasha. The only other people on the floor were Christiana, Melanie and Jordan. They were the only 3 other people in the company who knew who Brad really was as he scurried around doing tasks for Christiana. Melanie and Jordan both watched Brad from afar. They had not spoken to him since he had come back to the company en femme the day before. They were both uncomfortable with treating him like a secretary given how closely they worked with him in the past. Unlike the support staff, with the exclusion of Christiana, they had a working relationship with him as a man. Melanie and Jordan both knew that they were going to have to address him that afternoon when they met with Christiana and the Bennett brothers at the lunch meeting. They loathed the scenario they were going to find themselves in as they felt that they were going to be in an untenable position. They knew that they would have to treat Brad like a secretary, regardless of the consequences, so as to not give away to the Bennett brothers that there was more to the feminized Brad than met the eye. Sasha called Brad's phone and told him that Richard and Lane Bennett had arrived. Brad got to his feet and announced their arrival to Christiana. Christiana nodded at Brad and told him to bring them into the conference room. Brad nodded and went out to meet them. Brad had spoken to them on the phone before when he was the boss, so he made sure to disguise his voice. He addressed them in a higher than usual tone that made the men cringe a little before he led them to the conference room. Brad sat them down and said, Miss Stone will be with you shortly. Thank you, miss, Richard said as Lane nodded while Brad walked out of the room. Brad saw Melanie and Jordan heading towards the conference room while Christiana was walking towards it as well. Christiana looked at Brad and asked, Did you offer them anything? No, Brad replied, realizing his mistake. You're really absent-minded today. You know that? Come on, follow me, Christiana replied in a terse tone. Brad put his head down and exhaled heavily through his nose. He walked in behind her before Christiana asked, Can I offer either of you gentlemen a drink? Richard and Lane looked at each other for a moment before they asked, What do you mean by a drink? It could be an adult beverage, it could be a non-adult beverage, Christiana replied with a smirk as she shrugged her shoulders. Richard clapped his hands together and asked, What do you got? Christiana looked over at Jordan, who kept a cabinet full of liquor in his office for when he met with clients and important guests. Jordan told them what he had. Richard nodded and asked for a gin on the rocks, while Lane asked for one as well. Christiana told Brad to get herself, Melanie and Jordan one as well. Brad hurried out of the room and went into Jordan's office. He took hold of the glasses and carried them into the kitchenette. He put ice cubes in each of the glasses and carried 3 of them back into Jordan's office where he poured the gin. Brad carried 3 full glasses to the conference room. He placed one down in front of Melanie, Christiana and Lane as Christiana glared at him. Brad asked her, "Is there something else you need, Miss Stone? Where's Richard and Jordan's drinks?" Christiana asked. "Oh, I couldn't carry them all. I go finish up and bring them in." "Well, hurry up, girl," Christiana said. "Yes, Miss Stone," Brad replied as he walked towards the door. "You'll have to excuse her, she's new," Christiana said as Brad walked out of the room to get Richard and Jordan's drinks. Brad bit his lip and wanted to scream at her for the tone she used when she said those words. From Christiana's smile, Brad deduced that it was a form of payback for the time he had asked Jordan to excuse Christiana's incompetence in front of her, shortly after Christiana had been hired. Brad scuttled towards Jordan's office in the mincing steps his heels and the skirt of his dress forced him to take. He clasped the last 2 glasses of gin and hurried back to the conference room. He felt out of breath as he placed them down on the table with a forced smile on his face before he stepped out of the conference room. As he did so, he saw Sasha waving towards him. She told him that the delivery boy was there with the food. Brad rushed towards the front of the office and gave the man a tip before he took hold of the food and carried it towards the conference room with Sasha's assistance. Brad and Sasha set up the trays of food while Christiana continued her meeting with the clients and the company's 2 other corporate directors. As Sasha left the room, Christiana told Brad to make up plates for everyone at the table. Brad complied without saying a word, knowing that a secretary had to keep her mouth closed around clients. Brad served each person at the table before he went to leave the room. Melanie and Jordan thanked Brad as he placed the plates down in front of him, but otherwise tried their best to pay little attention to him. Brad could not help but contrast to the way they usually hung on his every word since he was the one who placed them in the positions of power they found themselves in. As Brad went to exit the conference room, Christiana stopped him and asked him to take down some notes. Brad got a pen and a pad of paper and took down the new proposed deal from the Bennett Brothers Company. Brad shuddered as he realized that Christiana had made a deal that brought him closer to spending more time as her secretary. Brad had thought that there was not a chance that she would increase the company's profits at all. Brad felt nauseous as he wrote down the terms of the deal that was fairly mid-sized for the company. After the meeting, Brad had lunch at his desk before he finished reorganizing the files. As Brad sat down at his desk, he wondered about one of the files he had seen in the cabinet and had not thought about in some time. Brad wondered about the current status of the Tilton account as Christiana walked by him and into her office. Brad sat down at his computer to type up his notes as Christiana requested, but he was more concerned with answering his own question regarding the Tilton account. Brad clicked the drive where the client's records were taken. He located the Tilton account and clicked on the file he needed to view. Brad blinked twice as he saw the message on his monitor. He stared at it in silence as he kept rereading the same words, "Denied entry. You don't have permission to ask this file. Please contact your systems administrator." Brad shook his head and thought it was a mistake. He tried to access another client file and got the same message. Brad slapped the desk as he stood up and walked towards Christiana's opened office door. He knocked on it and entered. Christiana put up her left pointer finger as she read the document in front of her. Brad stood there in an uncomfortable silence for 2 minutes before Christiana said, "What can I do for you, Bailey? I tried to access the Tilton account file and the system wouldn't let me. So, I need to access it." "Why?" Christiana said as she put down her pen. "Why?" "It's a fair question," dear. I didn't ask you to look up anything on it. Brad went to respond, but paused as he looked at the impatient look on Christiana's before he said, "Okay, fine, but why don't I have access?" "None of the secretaries do. We can't be sharing that information with everyone." "But I'm not like them. I need to know." "No, you're just like them. Bailey, you need to understand that you're not special here. You're just another secretary. Don't look for special treatment. This company only discloses to you what we want you to know. That's how this company has always operated, as I'm sure you are well aware." Brad wanted to scream at her, but he knew that his desired access was an unreasonable request for a secretary given the rules he had set up for the company. Brad had created them and, now, he had to live by them too. Brad nodded his head at Christiana and walked out of her office in silence. He strolled back to his desk and sat down. He placed his elbows on the desktop and rubbed his temples. The despair that was overtaking him felt like too much for him to handle. Brad felt that Christiana was taking their swap too far. Brad believed that he had treated her better than she was treating him, but the slights she had given him were all similar to things that he had done to her. Brad wondered if she felt as demeaned by it all as he did. Brad tried to cheer himself up by talking with the girls for a little bit, but he was never able to do it for long before he found himself doing another task for Christiana. He was already behind on his list and knew that some of it would have to wait for the next day, but Brad felt that he had to get as much of it done as possible. Consequently, Brad set about setting up more meetings for Christiana, typing her proposed changes to the office work rules, sorting her mail and cleaning up his workspace and Christiana's. As the workday ended, Brad slipped off his heels and put his flats back on. He closed his pocketbook after putting the heels inside it. He then slung the bag onto his shoulder and headed towards the elevator with his head down. The gnawing feeling in his stomach intensified with each step as he thought about the many weeks he had left to keep making the same walk in skirts. Brad could not help but feeling that he had made a terrible mistake as he watched the elevator doors open. Brad awoke the next morning with the familiar back pain greeting him as he slowly got out of his bed to turn the alarm off. Brad got ready for another day at work and headed out the door dressed in a jade-colored V-neck dress with a crossover bodice, an accordion-pleated skirt and a banded waist with a silver belt. As he stepped out of his building, Brad cringed at the scent of a neighboring fish market. It seemed to have gotten worse than it had been when he smelt the prior mornings. Brad wondered if his decreased arousal and enjoyment of his situation had made him begin to fully realize what surrounded him. Brad found himself gagging until he reached the subway station and descended the steps at an angle. As he waited for the train, he could not seem to shake the smell from his nose as the hot subway air made him start to sweat. Brad boarded the train and fought for a seat. He sat down and stared down at the floor of the subway train. As the train made its way towards the station for his office, Brad could not help but dread the new indignities he was sure the day would bring. The train came to a stop at the station and Brad headed back towards the surface streets that led towards his office building. He went into the building and went to his desk. He sighed as he opened up his purse and saw his black 3-inch heeled pumps with a peep toe and a mesh bow at the vamp. He took off his flats and cursed at the heels as he put them on his feet. While he still loved the way he looked in them, he loathed the prospect of wearing them all day. The thrill that he always had when he had put them on and pretended to be a secretary was gone. The only thing left was his dread regarding the pain they would cause him. Brad turned his attention to the task list that Christiana had left for him. Brad looked it over and got to work as he wondered about how he could get out of his contract. As Christiana walked into the office early in the afternoon after a full morning of meetings, Brad followed her into her office. Brad looked at her and told her how much he hated his job. He told that he could not wait for the 3 months to end. Christiana shook her head and explained, "We have a contract." Regardless of Brad's complaints, Christiana informed Brad that she was going to hold him to the formal deal they had made. Brad knew what would happen if he breached the contract. He knew that she had him where she wanted him for the next 3 months. Brad countered by telling her, "If you don't agree to swap back with me now, I'm going to let you go when I take this place back over." "That's a risk I'm willing to take," Christiana replied with a smirk. "Come on, this isn't fair." "Fair? You agreed to this and, now, you want to get out of it because it doesn't match up perfectly with whatever perverted fantasy you may have had. Free will is a real bitch, isn't it?" Christiana interjected. Brad wanted to scream at her, but he held his tongue and stormed out of her office. He walked down the corridor to collect himself. The other administrative workers noticed his despair and Allison got to her feet and asked what was wrong. Brad said that it was nothing, not wanting to admit that he could not deal with doing what they did for a living. Allison hugged Brad and said, "Whatever it is, it's okay." Brad felt excited by the feeling of her buxom body pressed against his, but he knew that her embrace was only done in a platonic way. Brad had seen Allison's boyfriends in the past and they were nothing like him. He also knew that he was not in her league anyway. Allison asked if he would like to go out after work with her Sasha. Brad thanked her, but he told her he could not even though he had nothing else planned. Brad decided that he would rather sulk in silence than hear more about secretarial work after the workday ended. As the business hours came to a close, Brad left along with the other support staff as Jordan, Melanie and Christiana continued to work. Brad went back home and made himself a quick dinner after changing out of his work clothes. Brad turned on the television and rested with his feet up on the couch. He heard his cell phone ringing a few minutes after. He recognized the number. It was a friend of his that he rarely saw and did not tell that he was going abroad to relax for some time. Knowing that he could not see the man even if he wanted to give in his feminized appearance, Brad ignored the call. As the phone stopped ringing, Brad realized how alone he would be over the following 3 months. His feminization was keeping him away from those people in his private life and the people at work he had spent the most time with. Brad knew that going forward he was going to have to become one of the girls with his fellow members of the company's support staff in order to have something resembling a supportive relationship while he went through what he was sure would be the most trying time of his life. Brad counted down the days to the end of his 3 months en femme. He kept a calendar in his small apartment kitchen and placed an X on every workday that passed as he looked forward to the end of his time in heels. Brad frequently dreamed about being a man again. He would walk back into the office and assert himself more so than he had ever done before. He thought about becoming more hands-on with the clients and making his presence known to all of his employees rather than slipping amongst them as just another face that disappeared into an elevator. Still, Brad had recurring nightmares that Christiana would disclose his en femme activities. He knew that if he let her go as he threatened that there was a chance that she would irrationally reveal his feminized appearance to those outside of the company no matter how much it would cost her. Brad knew all too well that even rational people make unreasoned decisions. Every time he woke up and put on a dress or skirt for his day at work, he was confronted by just such a decision. The 3 months he spent en femme in the office were the most trying time of his life. He hated being bossed around by Christiana and was increasingly treated as her secretary by Melanie and Jordan despite their best efforts to avoid him. The other administrative workers on the floor provided him with his only respite. While he was simply one of the girls among them, Brad took pleasure in their office gossip and discussions about television shows he never watched. While Brad would have much preferred to talk about politics and sports, he was happy to talk about anything that got his mind off of his minor role in the company. Brad felt that the hours he spent working for Christiana seemed to grow longer as the weeks passed. Although he still only worked an 8-hour workday, the little tasks that Christiana broke up his days with made him frustrated as he frequently felt unable to accomplish anything. This frustration was not lost on Christiana as she had experienced it when he was her boss. Christiana liked making Brad feel the same things he had made her feel before their roles were reversed. Brad's home life had grown tedious too. While he was able to occasionally go outside in the male clothes he had purchased for himself on the weekend, his thin arched eyebrows resulted in occasional gay slurs being directed at him. Brad felt bruised and beaten by the words and would invariably retreat to his apartment after each such encounter. Brad sometimes felt that the walls of the small apartment he frequently sequestered himself in when he was not en femme seemed to be closing in on him. He felt that the cramped apartment got smaller by the day, especially as he grew more fond of daydreaming of living in the beautiful home he had built for himself on the water. Brad strolled into the office on the final day of his contractual 3 months en femme, feeling a slight sense of relief. He sat down at his chair after instinctively smoothing out the skirt of his sleeveless draped front dress with a pleated rounded neckline and ruched sides. Brad huffed as he looked over his task list for the day. It was nothing that he had not done before. Brad shrugged as he started working on the list before he received a phone call at a little past 10. Brad answered the call as he had for months. "Hello, thank you for calling Conglemo Enterprises, desk of Miss Christiana Stone. I'm Bailey. How may I help you?" "Hello, this is Kurt Gilmore for Christiana Stone." Brad processed the name he instantly recognized. "Kurt Gilmore?" Brad repeated. "Yes, that's correct, Mississippi. 1 second, please." Brad put the call on hold and clasped his head. He had a number of salespeople trying to obtain work from Kurt Gilmore's company for years. Brad thought about hanging up the phone, fearful of what the man had to tell Christiana. As Brad stared at the phone, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Brad stared up at Christiana's beaming face. She reached across him and picked up the phone and said, "I'll take the call here, doll." Christiana pressed the blinking button and said, "Hello, Kurt." The joyful tone used by Christiana made Brad's stomach feel like it had been tied in knots. He began to take short, rapid breaths as he felt as if he was going to faint. Christiana's silent nodding to the words he could not quite make out caused a nervous sweat to come onto his brow. His foot tapped wildly against the floor as he prayed that they had not struck a deal large enough to keep him en femme for another month. The thought of living in Christiana's small apartment on her meager salary another day longer made him want to cry. While he still had a fortune in the bank and stocks from his time as the head of the company, Brad did not want to tap into it. He had spent his life, prior to the last 3 months, constantly increasing his wealth. Brad desperately wanted to go back to doing so. Brad knew that he could not walk away from the business if Christiana had earned more time as her skirted assistant. He would lose his controlling stake in company, which was the source of over 70% of his fortune. Christiana responded after a long silence, "Yes, Kurt, the contract was signed by us last week. Have you had a chance to sign it?" "You got approval," Christiana said in a bubbly voice after she heard Kurt's response. Christiana's words and tone caused a feeling of despair to come over him. "I'll be stuck at this fucking desk another month, maybe even 2. Fuck me," Brad thought as he clasped his head while Christiana continued to speak with the new client's representative. "Yes, it's been a pleasure talking with you, Kurt. Thanks again." "Okay, bye-bye," Christiana said before she reached across the desk and placed the phone down in front of Brad. Christiana smirked at Brad before she walked into her office. Brad felt uneasy as he watched her walk away. He wondered how much more time she had earned to keep her position as the chief executive office and president of the company. Brad tried to get his mind off of it by doing the various tasks that she provided for him to do. No matter what he did, however, Brad found that getting his mind off the subject was impossible. It preoccupied his mind as he did the many thankless and mindless tasks that he was expected to do as a secretary. As Brad sat back down at his desk after faxing a document for Christiana, he noticed a new email from Christiana in his mailbox. Brad took a deep breath before he opened the email. He immediately saw that the email had been sent to everyone in the company. Brad felt sickened as he read the heading in the email announcing the deal with the international conglomerate that Kurt Gilmore worked for. He scoured the email looking for the bottom line number that would tell him just how much longer he would be in skirts and heels. Brad froze as he read the number that was far higher than he ever expected. He stared blankly at the monitor for a few minutes as he tried to do the math in his head. He kept thinking about the number that he kept coming to in his head before he clicked on the computer's calculator program. Brad typed in the number in the contract and divided it by the number agreed upon in the contract that would extend their role reversal. The same number that he reached in his head came upon the computer screen, 69. Brad almost fainted as he realized that Christiana's success at running the company had ensured that he would be spending more than half a decade as her personal secretary. Brad thought to himself that there had to be a way to entice her to giving up her position. Brad, however, knew that the salary and dividends that she was receiving would be enough to make Christiana richer than she ever dreamed of being. Brad's frenzied mind went blank as his eyes fixated on the number again. The sounds of the office workers discussing the deal down the corridor was something that he could not process at that moment. As Brad sat dumbfounded at his secretarial desk, Christiana peeked her head out of her office door and looked him over. She smiled down at him as she said, "Oh, Bailey, please go get Melanie and Jordan and tell them to come to my office. Oh, and make sure that Jordan brings the top-shelf scotch and 3 glasses, it's time to celebrate." Brad slowly closed his eyes and hoped that he was imagining the whole thing. He opened his eyes and saw the number still on the monitor over the open email disclosing the deal with the Kurt Gilmore's company. Brad looked at Christiana's ebullient expression and put his head down. Brad slipped his feet into his red Sienna 3.5-inch heel pumps and walked towards where Melanie and Jordan's offices were located. As Brad took each step, he kept repeating in his mind, 6 years. Almost 6 fucking years. The vacant look in Brad's eyes told Melanie everything she needed to know about how Brad was taking the news when he asked her to go and see Christiana. Melanie smiled briefly at him before she got up and hugged him as she said, "Don't worry. The longer you're a secretary, I'm sure the easier it will get. You'll probably forget all about what you used to be." Brad could tell that Melanie was not even convinced by her words. He nodded and thanked her before he walked into Jordan's office. Jordan nodded at Brad's announcement and collected 2 glasses and a bottle of scotch. He asked Brad to carry the 3rd glass into Christiana's office. Brad took hold of it and followed Jordan down the corridor that led towards Christiana's office suite that he had designed especially for himself. Brad wondered if he would ever be the boss and sit in it behind the executive's desk again. He knew Christiana had plenty of time to earn him more years behind her old desk. Brad realized that it was a matter of if and not when regarding his chances to resume his old position. As Brad walked into Christiana's office carrying a glass for her, he saw her smiling face and knew that he had shackled himself indefinitely in the secretarial prison of his design.